On the internet, comparing things is a staple, especially when it comes to military vehicles. You can find comparison videos on YouTube dating back a decade, comparing raw specifications by number crunching in a bid to see which vehicle is better, completely ignoring tactics and how these vehicles would be utilized. This methodology has creeped its way into all sorts of internet groups. Lately, I've been doing research on the space shuttle, and this trope has made its way into space enthusiast circles. For a lot of you, you can probably see where this is going. The space shuttle often finds itself pitted against its Soviet equivalent, the Buran. So, let's talk about the Buran. This video is not going to delve too deeply into the technical aspects of the vehicle. I will be bringing up what is relevant to the topic at hand. In a similar vein to my video on the Abrams, this is going to be a response to the public perception of the Buran. The most prominent narrative as of now is that Buran was actually better than the space shuttle. Because look at all the advanced technology it had. It landed by itself. It was more efficient than the space shuttle. It had a bigger payload capacity. To tell you the truth, I was actually in this camp for a while. I saw all these videos explaining how Buran was more impressive than the space shuttle. After all, these people with millions of subscribers and flashy videos can't be wrong. Right? That was until I started doing my own research. What this video is meant to do is put Buran into context, because upon watching a few videos on the topic, it's clear that we're not getting the full picture. If you read about Buran on the internet, you'll likely be impressed by all the talk of its advanced systems. I was too. Until I started doing research. What I found is that Buran, in my opinion, is extremely overrated. Its capabilities have been heavily exaggerated by propaganda and misinformation. Now, before we get into the video, I want to make something clear. I am not arguing that the Soviets were incapable of making their own space shuttle. Nor am I arguing that the Buran would not have been as capable or even better than its American counterpart, had the project been allowed to continue. What I am arguing against is the common notion that the Soviets had a fully functional spacecraft that could rival the American shuttle. I would also like to address additional details throughout the video. I'm not going to bore everyone with the history of the Buran, because that's not what this is about, and this video is already going to be long. We've got a lot of work to do. We will deal with the history as it pertains to the particular topics. However, before we move on, there's some terminology we need to go over. Buran is commonly used to refer to the class of orbiter. There is more to this, and things will get confusing. Trust me, I will address this in the video. Energiya is the system that is equivalent to the external tank and SRBs seen on the American space shuttle. However, instead of simply being a way for Buran to get into orbit, Energiya was a specialized rocket. It had its own guidance system and everything. With that out of the way, let's begin. Upon looking at these videos, it doesn't take a scholar to see that this was a direct response, or dare I say, a copy of the American space shuttle. Indeed, whether or not Buran is a copy of the space shuttle is a bit of a hot topic of discussion. Commentary on the subject goes one of two ways. Either there is an unwillingness to directly answer the question, or we're given an implication that it wouldn't matter even if it was a copy, because Buran was better anyway.
And in a lot of ways, it was actually more capable and robust than the American space shuttle.
The answers are often complicated and long-winded, and a lot of times don't really go anywhere. So, what is the answer? Do we have to comb through hundreds of thousands of documents? Do we have to travel through a maze of restricted archives? No. The answer is yes. It's just yes. It's a copy of the space shuttle. I know it's not a satisfying answer, but sometimes things really are that simple. Regardless of how many times you type form follows function into the comment section. The reason I'm bringing this up is not necessarily because I've seen claims to the contrary, but because people who address this particular topic, whether they think the Buran is a copy or not, tend to overthink this. and none of them actually end up answering what is a simple yes or no question.
Did the KGB perform one of the 20th century's greatest rip-offs? Well, yes and no.
I hate it when people say that. The answer is yes. It's a copy. Many of you are probably headed to the comment section to point out all the differences. Okay, yeah, I'm not saying there aren't differences between the two, but a Tu-4 doesn't stop being a reverse-engineered B-29 just because it used different engines. You don't need to do hard-hitting research. You just need to ask the Soviets. They openly admit that this is what they were doing. In the context of Buran, I think what matters is not so much outward appearance or technical specifications, but rather what the Soviets intended to do. To put to rest any doubt, here's one of the design concepts of the Buran shuttle. This is called the OS-120. It is basically a carbon copy of the American space shuttle. Eventually, the Soviets decided upon a compromise between the OS-120 and something called the MTK-VP, resulting in the OK-92, which eventually led to the finalized design of the Buran. While the Buran is not a direct copy of the shuttle, you can see what the Soviets were reaching for. So, let's settle this. This is intended to be as close to the space shuttle as possible. If not a direct copy of the space shuttle, it's about as close as you're going to get without the teacher noticing that you cheated on a test. Now, that being said, they were designed under different circumstances. The Soviets were paranoid that the American space shuttle was a military vehicle, and Buran was designed as a result of that paranoia. While tankies love to espouse the incorrect claim that the Soviet Union's space ventures were solely for the betterment of science and totally not, politics and propaganda, what they fail to realize is that out of these two vehicles, one was designed for the betterment of humanity, the other one is Buran. The Energiya-Buran system was intended as a weapon, and the Soviets designed Buran as close to the American space shuttle to match its capabilities. According to Energiya-Buran by Bart Hendrickx and Burt this time around, the Russians were not sure what the ultimate objectives of the American program were. Whereas the goal of Apollo unequivocally had been to put a man on the moon, the motives behind the development of the space shuttle were much more nebulous from the Russian perspective. Fearing the military capabilities of the shuttle, they felt it necessary to build an equivalent system, but unsure of what exactly the threat was, they had little choice but to stick closely to the American design to make sure they would be able to respond to whatever strategic mission the shuttle would eventually perform. Buran was built not out of some fundamental need in the Soviet space program, but as an answer to potential military and other applications of the space shuttle. This would eventually become the root cause of its downfall in the early 1990s. As more proof of this, one needs to look no further than Energiya's first launch. Literally, the first thing Energiya carried into space was something called Skiff-DM, also known as Polyus, which was, for lack of a better term, a precursor to a laser weapon designed to shoot down enemy satellites and ICBMs. The Soviets feared that the space shuttle could launch nuclear missiles from orbit, or capture a Soviet satellite to bring it back to the US for study, which, obviously, it was never intended to do. That's right, the most expensive space program in the history of the Soviet Union was created for something that wasn't happening. That's a fairly important aspect of this that's just kind of glossed over, or at best mentioned in passing in videos whose only goal is to paint the Soviets as quote-unquote more efficient than those fat, stupid Americans. Some people like to portray the Soviets as victims in this situation. The Soviets' fears were justified because they ran the calculations and found that NASA's payload figures for the shuttle were consistent with a military vehicle. Buran was a response to the US's big mean Star Wars program. First of all, the Soviet shuttle was in development well before the Strategic Defense Initiative was even announced. Secondly, what these people don't realize is that the Soviets had their suspicions that the shuttle was a nuclear bomber because they had their own nuclear aspirations for space in order to have a first strike capability, which, by definition, is offensive, not defensive. And while things like the fractional orbital bombardment system never saw service, the Russians were likely speculating from experience, and were projecting their own aspirations onto the United States. Some people claim that the space shuttle performed secret missions, one of which was a training mission for essentially dive-bombing Moscow from orbit. This is not true. This is a myth based on a Soviet report that the shuttle would be used to launch objects from space. For all intents and purposes, This was merely a way to justify the Soviet spaceplane program. Now, the shuttle did deploy classified payloads for the Department of Defense and Air Force, many of which are still secret. People point to these payloads in order to say that Soviet fears were justified.
And it must therefore have been intended primarily for deploying military satellites. Some went so far as to suggest it could be used as an orbital nuclear bomber, launched from Vandenberg to strike major Soviet cities with little warning. Now, to be completely fair, the shuttle was in part an asset for the US Air Force, and in retrospect, the economics did indeed not stack up. It was used to deploy secret payloads.
However, I think you guys are missing the point, because I think we can all agree that there's a vast ocean of difference between the space shuttle deploying a few satellites for the DoD and being the first strike nuclear bomber that the Soviets thought it was. Also, the first orbital flight of the space shuttle didn't happen until 1981. By this time, the Soviet spaceplane program was already 5 years into development. While these may have spurred Soviet fears, it is impossible for these classified payloads to have been a reason for the Soviets starting the Buran program, as people seem to imply. I'm sorry, I really have to stress the irony of Russians constantly accusing the Americans of trying to weaponize space, when it was the Soviets that launched a military space station into orbit that was armed with a gun. And no, I don't think calling it a defense weapon matters. The SDI program also has defense in the name, yet, as we have seen, that doesn't stop you guys from using that as justification for Russian weapons programs. If you're at all familiar with Buran, read articles about Buran, and have heard people talk about Buran, you have probably noticed that a certain aspect is singled out for praise: the automatic landing system. The Soviets played this up to death, and people sing its praises to this day. Let's take this video from user Mustard. Before we even get to Buran, there's a few problems with this video. From calling the shuttle's solid rocket boosters expendable,
But because the main engines were not powerful enough to put the shuttle into orbit, it also needed the help of 2 expendable solid rocket boosters.
they were not.
As the solid rockets were jettisoned and parachuted into the ocean, where they were picked up so that they can be refurbished and used again.
To claiming the US gave up on expendable rockets and went all in on the space shuttle.
And so by the 1970s, America abandoned expendable rockets, which could only be used once, and went all in on space shuttles.
This is nonsense. While the original plan was for the shuttle to replace expendable rockets, the US never stopped using them. Throughout the life of the shuttle, the US was using Atlas, Titan, Minotaur, and Delta rockets. Most of them would outlive the shuttle. The Delta rocket family, entering service in 1960, wasn't retired until April of 2024. That was last month from the time I'm typing this. He claims the world learned about Buran in 1988.
In 1988, the world learned that the Soviet Union also had a space shuttle. They had been secretly developing it for well over a decade.
That's also false, considering I have a book from 1985 that doesn't mention Buran by name, but it does say that the Russians were working on a large shuttle system with strap-on boosters with 3 main engines on the core stage. Put 2 and 2 together. But, as with many people on the internet, a feature he singles out is the Buran's automatic landing system.
The Western media was impressed, especially by its fully automatic landing system.
People love to talk about how Buran flew by itself. Automatically. People hear this and immediately assume that Buran must be the more advanced design. A machine flying by itself? That's so futuristic. The Buran was more advanced than the space shuttle. These people do not know what they're talking about. From a technological standpoint, manually flying a spacecraft, especially one as big as the space shuttle, is actually far more impressive than a shuttle that flies automatically. What, did you think they just flew it like a plane? No. Flying the space shuttle was extremely difficult, and required a highly skilled crew and a plethora of advanced systems to operate properly. Now, let's talk about that automatic landing system. Everyone praises the Buran for landing all by itself. This was such a phenomenal feat in 1988. Nothing even comes close. This was so advanced for the time. It wasn't. One of the problems I'm noticing is that people make increasingly bold claims about Buran. It was not, as I saw one person claim, the only unmanned spaceflight in history. Do I need to explain why that is wrong? By 1988, automatic landing systems were nothing new. Experiments with automatic landing systems for aircraft were conducted as early as the 1940s, and commercial aircraft with Category 1, Category 2, and Category 3 certifications, which required automatic landing systems, have been around since the 1960s. False equivalency, you say? Because we're talking about spacecraft, not airplanes? Okay, let's look at another example from 20 years prior. The landing of the Apollo lunar module was designed to be fully automatic, with the added ability to have input from the crew. Many of its major functions, like P-63 through P-65, were fully automatic. It's often stated that Neil Armstrong heroically took manual control of the LEM and landed it by itself. This is not true. During P-66, the AGC is still very much in control of the vehicle. The book I'm reading, The Apollo Guidance Computer by Frank O'Brien, even adds this caveat when addressing the issue. I should add that P-66 was also fully optional. Had it not been activated and remained on P-65, the lunar module would have landed by itself, guided by its computers and radar. The AGC even compensates for the rotation of the moon. However, there was a more relevant vehicle that also had an automatic landing system. The Space Shuttle. It always had that capability. In the Mega Projects video discussing Buran, Simon says, that the shuttle's autonomous functions were added in an upgrade, implying the shuttle never had such a capability up to that point.
Another key difference between the two, and the one that gave the Buran a definite edge, was that it was designed for both piloted and fully autonomous flight, whereas the shuttle needed to be piloted at all times. The Space Shuttle was later fitted with automated landing capability, but this came long after the Buran had faded into obscurity.
This is not true. In fact, there were several missions where the auto-landing functions were activated, such as STS-2 and STS-3. This one aspect is so ingrained in the public psyche as the thing that sets Buran apart from the Space Shuttle that, at this point, I think people just can't accept that anything else had such a system. Now, there is an asterisk here. The shuttle's landing gear, drogue chute, data probe, and fuel cells had to be activated or deactivated manually. This is why you see people using sneaky language, like Buran having a fully automatic landing system, all the while implying the American counterpart had no such capability. And while saying that Buran had a fully automatic landing system and the shuttle didn't is technically true, what sets Buran and the shuttle apart is not the presence of an automatic landing system, but the fact that Buran could deploy its landing gear, activate its drogue chute, and turn off its fuel cells automatically. Or at least, it would if the 1K orbiter had fuel cells. We'll get to that later. The Buran fanboys are probably jumping for joy right now. You see, the Buran did all that automatically. We told you it was more advanced than the shuttle. Not so fast. While you're sitting there jumping for joy about how advanced the Buran was, perhaps you should ask yourself why you would want a computer to do that. What many people don't realize is that this was for the safety of the crew. You want human beings to do these things on a vehicle designed to carry people. Had any of these been accidentally deployed early by, say, a computer, it would have put the crew in danger. Which I find funny because people like to talk about how much safer Russian technology is. What Buran fanboys don't realize is that there is a flip side to having technology do things for you. To sum things up, the shuttle was perfectly capable of autonomously re-entering the atmosphere all the way to a designated landing zone. Yeah, it sounds a lot less impressive when you filter out the propaganda and put things into perspective, doesn't it? Buran proponents like to brag about the Buran course correcting in a headwind by automatically and unexpectedly flying in a circle, allowing it to choose the best path toward the runway. I want to make it clear that I'm not a scientist or engineer, but I'm sorry. After doing research, I'm not finding this all that impressive. Even if I thought it was impressive, it wasn't entirely different from what the shuttle was already capable of. During STS-3, Commander Jack Luzma activated Columbia's auto-landing function mid-flight in order to correct the shuttle's course due to strong wind before retaking control 120 feet off the ground.
But because of the strong westerly wind, we had to crab to the right. Right now, Jack is engaging the audio system, and you can see it making a quick correction to the right, then back to the left.
And that was 6 years earlier. Oh, but who cares? The Buran's computers worked perfectly. The landing was flawless. No, it wasn't, actually. Buran landed 190 meters short of the planned touchdown point and 9 meters off the center line. Now, I'm not saying the shuttle was spotless. It had its fair share of botched landings. But remember, people seem to think the Buran's landing was impeccable and worked perfectly. It wasn't, and it didn't. Mega Projects and Curious Droid claim that Buran landed just 10 meters from the designated landing zone,
bringing the Buran around for a second attempt, which saw the spacecraft touch down just 10 meters from its designated targeted landing spot.
Even battling a strong crosswind, the Buran touched down just 10 meters from the target mark on the runway.
This is from Wikipedia. This is the level of research these guys are doing. Tankies will tell you that the American shuttle was primitive and relied on beacons to land. Now, to be fair, this is true. The American space shuttle was primitive in this regard by utilizing beacons to land. The Soviets opted for a much more advanced system called the Radio Beacon Landing System. The Buran also used beacons. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. In fact, the Radio Beacon Landing System, abbreviated as RMS, was very similar to the American Microwave Scan Beam Landing System. Oh, but the Soviets weren't trying to copy the Americans, right guys? Obviously, I'm not going to delve into the technical aspects of this. That's not really the point. That's for far more qualified people to do. But I will put things into perspective. For all the boasting about the Buran's automatic landing system and how amazing it was, the US was capable of doing this 20 years prior on the moon. Lastly, I'd like to deal with this claim. I've seen people claiming that unmanned missions would have been routine had the Buran program continued. The Buran's first and only mission definitely gives that impression. However, with all the fawning over the automatic systems of Buran, people seem to be preoccupied with wondering how the Soviets did this, without asking why the Soviets did this. The Buran's maiden flight was unmanned because the Soviets traditionally tested their spacecraft unmanned. The US actually followed a similar routine. Considering this was a spacecraft designed to land like a plane, there was really no other way they could have done this. People talk as if unmanned Buran missions were going to be normal had the project advanced further. This is extremely short-sighted. The truth is far more complex, and, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't even think the Soviets themselves knew exactly what they were going to do in this regard, even if the program continued. What people fail to realize is that the 1988 launch of Buran was not a standard flight. The mission was to test its launching and landing capabilities. In fact, if the program had continued, the flights wouldn't have been standard for some time, considering the 1988 launch was one of a planned 10 test flights. There was definitely debate over this, and pushback from cosmonauts who didn't want to be replaced by automatic systems. In fact, there was similar pushback from American astronauts over the same issue when it came to the space shuttle. While things could have gone either way, or even if things were leaning in the direction of unmanned missions, the project was cancelled way too early for us to really know. The Soviets did a lot of upselling for the Buran, often espousing how much better the Buran was when compared with the American space shuttle, especially when it came to weather, which is a tradition that carries on to this day.
Spectators were stunned not only by its Goliath size, but also because it was allowed to fly in the rain, something the US Space Shuttle orbiter would have never been permitted.
Oh, those Americans, wanting to keep their overly complex spaceplane in tip-top shape. Those weak Americans would never, unnecessarily expose it to the elements when they didn't have to. What weaklings! One of the bold claims the Soviets made was that Buran was impervious to precipitation, including hail, unlike the weak American space shuttle. Now, before we just assume the Soviets were lying, there's actually shades of truth to this. The Soviets were not strangers to successfully launching rockets in inclement weather conditions. In the past, they had launched during what were, essentially blizzards. I mean, they have to. This is Russia we're talking about here. Well, the Baikonur Cosmodrome is in Kazakhstan, but you know what I mean. During the launch of the 1K orbiter, the conditions were bad and were worsening. A squall line approaching the launch site prompted multiple gale warnings, delaying the launch. However, the Soviets decided to launch anyway. They portrayed it as defying Mother Nature in the name of scientific progress. In the words of former cosmonaut Herman Titov, "We deliberately refused to postpone the launch and wait for ideal conditions. The value of the flight is that its program included the maximum sum of real and rather difficult tasks." So there you go. The Soviets launched Buran in the name of science and the betterment of mankind in the face of Mother Nature. And in the end, Buran performed spectacularly without a problem, only losing 7 of its nearly 40,000 thermal tiles.
The automated landing system brought Buran only 3 meters or 10 feet from its intended target. It lost only 8 of its 38,000 thermal protection tiles over the course of the flight.
Not so fast. The launching of the Buran at the time it did was steeped in politics. They launched in poor conditions, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. It was estimated that any delay in the launch would lead to further testing that would go well into the winter, where they would face even worse conditions than there were on that day, and would ultimately postpone the launch until spring at the earliest, thus weakening the support from the Soviet government, which, at the time, was already waning. But who cares? The Soviets were used to launching in bad conditions. The Buran could handle it. The problem? This was not a typical Soviet rocket launch. This was a spacecraft that was designed to land like a plane. And while people love to highlight the fact that it only lost 7 of its 38,000 thermal tiles when compared to STS-1, which lost 16, that doesn't even come close to telling the entire story. While only losing 7 thermal tiles, several dozen were severely damaged, showing signs of cracking, erosion, and melting. 2 blankets of thermal insulation were also missing, as were several gap fillers from under the vehicle. And remember what I said about the Soviets claiming that Buran could withstand hail? That turned out to be a lie. The tiles of the 1K orbiter were severely damaged by a hailstorm when traveling on the Miria in 1989. In fact, most of the aforementioned damage was attributed to falling ice. This is something that is conveniently missing from all these videos covering the topic. The Buran was not invincible just because it was made in Russia. It was a space plane that was meant to be treated with relative care, and the Soviets knew they were taking a risk by launching that day, especially with the Challenger disaster fresh in their minds, occurring a mere 2 years earlier. There was also a bit of tomfoolery going on with the meteorological support group at Mission Control. They were being pressured into giving reports that would support a launch, and as a result, were being, how do I put this lightly, economical with the truth. Weather reports showed wind gusts of up to 25 meters per second, but they only presented the lower wind speed values to the launch crew. To be on the safe side, I should probably mention that this is only based on a single eyewitness testimony. However, it seems to jive with everything that happened. If I can interject some speculation, I also think the Soviets may have been just a little bit lax with the launch. By virtue of being unmanned, there would have been no loss of life had the 1K orbiter been destroyed. They could simply say that it was a test flight, with no human casualties to save face. Again, this is just gross speculation on my part. Feel free to lambaste me in the comments section. However, it would explain why they strangely didn't have ice inspection teams examine the stack before launch, despite being present at the site, and ground control seeing large chunks of ice falling off the stack through their television monitors. Also, minor note here, this video by Megaprojects claims that the core stage of the Energiya rocket did not use spray-on insulating foam.
The Energiya rocket didn't have the same kind of segments and O-rings that caused the Challenger disaster, nor did it use foam, which was partially responsible for the Columbia disaster.
Where did you get that from? The Soviets used polyurethane on the core stage just like the space shuttle's external tank. God forbid we make the Buran seem even more like a copy of the American space shuttle than it already is. Let's talk about those jet engines. You'll often see people praising the Buran because it had jet engines. That way it could be tested without strapping it to the back of a plane, and could have multiple passes when trying to land after re-entry. Whereas the space shuttle was a dead-stick glider, as I saw one person put it. This is where I think people are getting a little bit confused when it comes to talking about the Soviet spaceplane program. When people talk about Buran, it becomes clear that they think the Soviet shuttle program only produced one thing: the singular spacecraft that we picture in our minds rolling down the runway with a MiG-25 chasing it. The one that actually went into space in 1988 was called the 1K Orbiter. This is the vehicle the word Buran is associated with, though the word Buran was used for multiple things throughout the project. The biggest problem I have with people who talk about Buran is their failure to distinguish the 1K Orbiter from the rest of the program. This makes the claims regarding it difficult to understand. The reality is that the Soviet shuttle program encompassed a wide variety of systems, including multiple full-scale mock-ups, as well as modules for crew training. The 1K Orbiter did not have jet engines. The jet engines, which were made by Sukhoi and were essentially a pair of Su-27 engines, were mounted to one test vehicle, that being the BTS-002, and it was purely for atmospheric testing. There were plans to put engines on the actual orbiters, but this was scrapped, and the holes that would have mounted them on the 1K Orbiter were covered in flexible thermal tiling. Saying that Buran had jet engines would perhaps be forgivable if people acknowledged that they were only used on one test vehicle. But no, people talk as if these things went into space. Here's something I'd like to address from Curious Droid. He makes it sound as if the engines were simply not ready by the time the 1K Orbiter launched, implying they were going to be added in future missions.
But difficulties in protecting them from the heat of re-entry, along with the extra fuel, equipment and weight which they added, caused delays and cost overruns, which meant that they were not ready for the first flight, and the Buran had to operate in glider mode without them.
No, the idea was scrapped, Curious Droid. It was not going to happen. One thing I find strange is that people praise the 1K for performing a successful landing on the first attempt, but then turn around and speak derisively about how the space shuttle had only one chance to get it right because it had no jet engines.
The US shuttle, on the other hand, could not use its main engines for landing, so it was always going to be an unpowered glider, and therefore could only have one chance to get its landing right.
I'm not saying that this is hypocrisy, it's just that the angle that people approach this topic from is extremely weird. Here's another claim. The Buran crowd has gotten it into their heads that the Buran had a higher payload capacity than the American space shuttle, though I had to do a bit of searching before they started giving me actual numbers. They claim 30 tons for Buran, as opposed to the 24 or 25 tons of the American space shuttle.
Doing this meant that Buran not only had a larger payload of 30 tons to the US shuttle's 24, but it could also be turned around much quicker.
This saved a lot of weight and allowed the orbiter to increase its payload capacity, bringing it to 30 tons as opposed to the shuttle's 24 tons.
Big surprise, this is not true. First of all, the biggest problem I have is that people don't distinguish whether they're talking about metric tons or short tons. NASA quotes the payload capacity of the space shuttle as 65,000 pounds, which hovers just around 30 tons if we're talking metric, and more than 30 if we're talking short tons. In either case, a figure of 24 tons is just wrong. It should be noted that when the Soviets were designing their spaceplane, their goal was to match the shuttle's payload capacity, which was 30 tons. However, it's a completely moot point anyway, because the 1K orbiter was never capable of carrying that type of payload, and I found no evidence that it was even tested up to that point. For one thing, the 1K didn't even have an opening cargo bay, which is one of the reasons it orbited the Earth twice, as opposed to a traditional 3 times for Soviet test flights. Because the Soviets feared that this was one of the things that would contribute to overheating, though that's not to say it was traveling empty. It was carrying what was known as a 37 kb, which held scientific equipment as well as batteries to compensate for the lack of fuel cells. Before we move on, I just want to show how misleading claims like this can truly be. In this video by Mega Projects, They show a picture of an open cargo bay while talking about the capabilities of the Buran.
The Buran had a spherical compartment docking system with a diameter of 2.67 meters and a cylindrical tunnel leading to the androgynous peripheral docking unit, similar to the one on the shuttle, but could be extended further than the American version.
What this video fails to mention is that this is not a space-worthy Buran orbiter. Once again, this is the BTS-002 being displayed at the Technik Museum in Speyer, Germany. You can tell because you can see the jet engines in the back. And what he calls a spherical docking unit is actually a gas tank. This is not what the cargo bay of a space-worthy Buran orbiter would look like. Do you see how someone can be left with a false impression? Another claim is that Buran, being the 1K orbiter, had ejection seats.
And in an emergency, the Buran had ejection seats for the entire crew, which could function well on the launch pad or all the way up to 20 miles.
If the crew were on board, the pilot and the co-pilot had ejection seats, something which had been ditched in the US shuttle.
It did not. Again, this was only a paper specification. They were never installed on a space-worthy Buran orbiter, and I find it annoying that people talk like this. Ejection seats were only ever added to the BTS-002, and one was installed on the 2K orbiter. And that is a perfect segue into the next claim, that the Buran could carry 10 people instead of the space shuttle's wimpy 8. Again, this was nothing more than a paper specification. The 1K orbiter did not have the ability to carry anyone, let alone 10 people, and was never going to be able to, because, for one thing, it did not have a viable life support system, the fuel cells, and secondly, the Soviets found that modifying it to accommodate crew members would have been too expensive anyway. This claim also completely ignores what were known as launch-on-need missions. To put it simply, these were rescue missions. For example, here is the Space Shuttle Endeavour, which was moved onto the launch pad in the event anything happened to Space Shuttle Atlantis during a mission to service the Hubble Space Telescope during STS-125. If the mission commenced, it would have been known as STS-400, and if needed, it would have been able to carry up to 11 people. Wikipedia and Megaprojects, as you saw in that clip, claims that Buran had a docking mechanism. It did not. Things like the docking module and the robotic arm were meant to be installed on the 2K orbiter, which was never completed, let alone spaceworthy. You've probably noticed the problem. It's with the way people speak. Buran had ejection seats. Buran had a robotic arm. This terminology gives the impression that these devices were added to a space-worthy orbiter. They were not. Other false claims that are being spread are in regards to Energiya. People's understanding of Energiya are probably just as bad as Buran itself. People seem to think that Energiya's strap-on boosters, and sometimes even the entirety of Energiya itself, were fully reusable. Like this post on Quora, talking about how the strap-on boosters had specialized skids for landing and recovery. What this incredibly misleading post doesn't tell you is that this was just an idea that not only didn't leave the drawing board, but was unlikely to happen even if the project continued. The 6SL and 1L, which carried Polyus and Buran respectively, had the containers that would have housed the recovery equipment, but instead were filled with instrumentation. The closest this ever came to being a reality was a planned test on Energiya 2L. And guess what? It was never completed. You can't then turn around and claim that Energiya had a recovery system just because they were going to test it on this one particular mission that never even saw the light of day. The last we would hear of the 2L were plans to take its core stage and mate it with the 1K orbiter for permanent display at the rocket assembly and test facility at Baikonur. And that's where the story ends for this rocket. Energiya was not reusable. Let's put an end to this nonsense. Now, this is where I go into some speculation. The 4 strap-on boosters were 2 pairs of what were essentially the first stage of the Zenit rocket. The strap-on boosters shared upwards of 70% commonality with the Zenit's first stage. The Soviets had originally planned for the Zenit's first stage to be reusable, utilizing the same recovery equipment as they had planned to use on Energiya. However, this would have added considerable weight to the rocket, and decreased the payload capacity to 7 tons, which the book Energiya-Buran rightfully calls unacceptable. This was later whittled down to simply recovering the engine section of the first stage, before the Soviets dropped the idea of reusability altogether after it was discovered it would have been monetarily inefficient. The point I'm making is that if the Soviets were unwilling to make a single Zenit booster reusable, I find it unlikely they would have done so with 4 of them at the same time. Here's something from Curious Droid that I would like to address. In a bid to make Energiya-Buran seem more efficient, he states that refurbishing the 3 main engines of the space shuttle took months of work, and points out that the Buran had thrusters in place of the main engines that were designed to withstand 66 flights.
One of the biggest problems slowing down the US shuttle launches was that the main engines had to be removed and refurbished after each mission. This was a major job which took months to complete. The Buran, on the other hand, had just thrusters which it used for manoeuvring in orbit, and which were rated for 66 flights without replacement.
First of all, that's a false equivalency. You're comparing the main engines of the space shuttle, which were designed to operate in an atmosphere, with thrusters designed for maneuvering in space. The analogous comparison would be the 4 RDS-0120 engines on the core stage, as they basically replaced what would have been the main engines on the Buran itself. What's even more perplexing about this is that Curious Droid acknowledges this in the video, but doesn't make the connection.
The major difference between the US shuttle and the Buran was that the Buran was unpowered. It didn't have main engines attached to it like the US shuttle. Instead, it would be attached to a giant heavy-lift rocket.
Secondly, he's so hell-bent on making the Russians sound more efficient that what he doesn't realize is that Energiya was entirely expendable, unlike the American shuttle system. Now, this video is not meant to glorify the American space shuttle. The fact that it was never as efficient as expendable rockets is not lost on me. However, this is not the space shuttle versus expendable rockets. This is the space shuttle versus the Buran. The whole purpose of a reusable spacecraft, among other things, is being able to reuse your engines, something the Buran couldn't do, making it basically pointless as a reusable spacecraft. Now, I don't want to be entirely cynical here. I want to give the Russians credit. Energiya being able to carry things into space other than Buran is neat. I do think it's a little strange that the best compliment that people can give a rocket is that it can carry things. It's a rocket, that's kind of what it's supposed to do, but nevertheless, it shows a level of versatility when compared to the American shuttle system. The Americans had a similar idea with their system that never came to fruition. It was called the Shuttle C. Though, strangely, you don't see people claiming that the Americans did such a thing, as people seem inclined to do with Energiya-Buran features that were never implemented. People need to understand that thinking of an idea is not the same as implementing it. If we're assigning credit based on what could have happened, then congratulations Great Britain, you made an aircraft carrier out of pykrete. For those who are curious, pykrete is a mixture of pulp and ice. In fact, I'd argue that the HMS Habakkuk was closer to becoming a reality than many of the things that Buran was credited for, because the British actually made a 1,000-ton model of the thing. You don't see people claiming the HMS Habakkuk entered service. By the logic of the Buran crowd, the US put the first satellite into space. Why not? After all, the US had the idea before the Soviet Union, and Sputnik was a response to Vanguard. That's the kind of logic you guys are using, and I guarantee all of you would not agree with that. As we have seen, people like to attribute all the wonderful things that Buran could have been, and pretend as if the Soviets had a vehicle with those capabilities. They did not. The 1K orbiter was, for all intents and purposes, a test vehicle. This needs to be put to bed. The Buran was not as capable as the American space shuttle. I think this is kind of an interesting situation, because it forces us to ponder how much credit we should give something for simply having proposed capabilities. As a total digression, I also love when people brag about how Buran didn't kill anybody. Not that it should have killed anyone, but how relevant of a point is that when you're talking about a vehicle that, on top of having no crew on board, only flew once? Not to glorify the American space shuttle, because I think we can all agree there were plenty of problems with it, and definitely some corruption going on with the upper levels of management, but compare the one test mission of the Buran with the 135 missions of its American counterpart. It's not even close. I've had enough. There is so much misinformation about this thing, and it's everywhere. Now, for some people, the ends justify the means. Maybe all of this doesn't matter for you, which is honestly fine. If you think all of this is negated because the Buran's mission was successful, I can't touch you. But all of the information I presented does fight with the idea that Buran was a fully capable vehicle that could compete with the American space shuttle. It wasn't. Not because the Soviets couldn't do it, but because the program still had a long way to go. The Buran, as it is perceived now, is overrated. Not bad, just overrated. This video wouldn't exist if people just did their own research, instead of human centipeding the information they get from YouTube. One thing I would like to mention is that my investigation into this topic wasn't particularly deep diving, nor was the information that hard to find. I was just looking for it. It's just that there's a lot of misinformation on the internet, and unfortunately, the misinformation is the loudest. When one of my subscribers reached out to me on Discord to ask what my future videos were going to be, I simply said the Buran, and completely unprompted, they brought up the point about the engines. That means the information is out there, and there are people who know what they're talking about. Even in those Quora posts, you'll see people making corrections in the comment section. The problem is that people are not going to be digging through the comment threads on Quora to find the right answer. The wrong information clearly has a bigger platform. It's not even close. As they say, a lie can run around the world before the truth has got its boots on. Though, that's not to say that any of these guys are lying. I will say this. None of the videos I addressed are particularly terrible, and this is obviously not a license to harass their authors. I guess I'm just kind of pissed off that these guys, several of whom have millions of subscribers, oftentimes across multiple channels, are spreading misinformation like this. They just get a lot of really important information wrong, and clearly, the wrong information is sticking. Like I said in my previous video, I'm not perfect. This subject involves space technology. I'm not one of the cool kids that understands this shit. Inevitably, there will be something wrong in this video. Obviously, you can't control what your audience does. But if you have an audience as big as these guys do, you have at least some obligation to get things right. Or else, you get millions of people believing the SRBs on the shuttle were expendable. The sad part is, I'm not under any delusion here. This video will not get as many views as Curious Droid or Mustard. Even after this video, people will go on believing that Buran had ejection seats or could carry 10 people, no matter how many times you hammer the point home. As much as I hate to say it, for whatever reason, on the internet, misinformation has a home field advantage. I may not accomplish what I set out to do when I started this project. However, it's probably going to take someone saying it in a video before people finally get it.